Welcome to Civil Discourse. I'm Jayme Marilyn.
And I'm Marilyn Brown.
And today we are discussing mindful activism. Um, I think we talk about mindful activism a lot, but just I would love to hear what it means to you,
hmm
just in a general sense.
Yeah. So to me, in a general sense, mindful activism, mindfulness is about awareness and being fully aware. And so bringing awareness into activism is about being aware not only of how you how I approach something from my perspective, but also intentionally doing the work to broaden my perspective to include other people's perspective that I don't automatically go towards. I think that's what's really important about bringing mindfulness to activism is expanding my own perspective on whatever that topic is that I'm approaching.
Yeah, for me, a big part of it to go with that is balance. I
Mhm.
feel mindfulness has a lot to do with balance in that when talking about activism, it's not just understanding your own feelings, it's understanding the feelings of others. It's not just understanding your own ideas, it's understanding the ideas of others. And when you approach specifically activism or politics or anything from that way, you move from a place of understanding as opposed to judgment. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck and where movements get stuck as they become these judgmental places of this is what we want, and it's a statement but it's not necessarily an action plan. People don't necessarily understand how to do that within the system that we need to work in, or how to change that system in order for new things to happen, and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. I think it's important to recognize that judgment and mindfulness are not related. Judgment when we judge something, we're not being mindful, and so and it's difficult because I think that that's a difficult concept to kind of understand because I think it's important to be able to say this isn't right. I'm opposed to this to this treatment or to this issue. I have a problem with this, but to also be able to bring a level of non-judgmental perspective to the people who view things differently. And so you can have an issue with the issue, but not. But I think a lot of times we get caught up in judging the people who support the problem rather than actually just like you said, coming from a place of being able to do to work on making change. If we're judging the people who are on the other side, we really can't move forward. And I think that's kind of where we are now with a lot of things is that we're caught up in this. We're kind of on two sides of a lot of things, and people are very polarized, and so it creates this space where we're not able to move forward at all.
Yeah, and I think on the judgment aspect, mindfulness is very much about a journey. It's a never ending process. There is no destination to it. And I think that's where judgment becomes a problem, because what I see politically and across everything in human life is that judgment are these end results. We got a certain amount of information and then we made an opinion. And that's our opinion, and now we're moving on to something else. And there's these little like steps to it, as opposed to what you're saying is yes, you can have an opinion, but what you're leading with is a desire to understand. It's not to form opinions, which is what humans seem to want to do. We want
Yes.
to lead with our opinion. We want to have an opinion before we have information.
Right. Yeah. And I think again, we've talked about this in past talks, but I think we're wired to do that. So that's kind of part of our survival is that we need to label things right away. That's good, that's bad, that's a threat, that's danger. And unfortunately, it it doesn't lead to us having a very broad perspective about a lot of things. It actually leads to us being very narrow in our focus in order to block out things that don't fit with what we already believe, which we're seeing a lot of as well, where you will, see people really kind of intentionally avoid facts or opinions that challenge their own and just not want to let those things in. Again, that's a survival technique. And so when we're wired in that way and we're approaching the world in fight or flight mode and in survival mode, then that's how we move through the world. And so mindfulness really is about working to come from a different perspective and slow things down and not have to take a stance of judging whether it's good or bad, just being curious, just being able to find out more, which I think is so important.
Yeah, it's just, we've talked about survival before, and it's just so interesting to me because I feel like I agree with everything you're saying, and that's how we're wired to survive. But so few of us today live in a place where those instincts are beneficial. I
Oh, yeah.
feel
Yeah.
so. We feel like we need to be in the survival mode, but we haven't. We're really not at that place. So it's almost counterproductive to be in it
Yes.
because you're shutting down and closing off when you're not in a life or death situation for
Right.
real. So then you stop yourself from being able to actually do the things you need to do to move forward and
Mhm.
make your situation better.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And I talk about this a lot with my clients that that's really what leads to anxiety. It's like we're looking for, we're kind of wired this way and wired for this survival, and yet we don't really need um, most of these tools in our day-to-day lives. And so everything starts to feel like life or death. Everything starts to bring about that response and that anxiety level to for us. And it's really interesting to just kind of see how, you look at little kids. I think about like 7 and 8 year olds and just how they kind of are learning to approach the world with school and with conditioning around team sports and things. I mean, we're conditioned at a pretty young age to take a lot of things way more seriously than they actually need to be. And it's we're having to kind of do the work to like decondition that and to take ourselves out of that place. And that work is a challenge and it takes practice.
Yeah, and I think it's important to make the distinction between the political realm we're living in, where, yes, a lot of things are very intense and they need to be taken seriously, versus it being something where we're in fight or flight mode. And I think that's what we're talking about. The difference is in
Yeah.
survival is moving to this instinctual place that's not, I don't want to say rational, but it's not mindful. Is the right word. And then you get caught up in it. And I hear a lot of people say on both sides, and it's the hypocrisy that exists, which is kind of the through line of what we've been talking about so far, about the problem in politics being too much emotion being involved. And I kind of go back and forth on this. They talk about the protesters and it being, oh, they're just upset, and they use very emotional words to kind of discredit the way others are feeling, which
Hmm.
is funny because in doing so they're expressing their own feelings, and then it becomes this back and forth of feelings and you never get to this intellectual place.
Right.
But it's also a balance that's needed. There is that you can't just say we can't think about people's emotions, we have to be intellectual and think about it rationally. Yes, you have to be rational, but you also have to, in that, take into consideration the way people are feeling and the experiences as many people as possible are having.
Yes. Yeah. 100%. And I think that's why, again, going back to mindfulness is so important because it's not just about being rational or seeing things on the rational side. You're taking into account those emotions. And a lot of times that's when we're most effective when something that we feel is driving what we're doing. I think that going back to talking about mindful activism, I think that mindful activism is something that feels important to you, important in your life and important. It's something that you feel like you have to say something about. You have to work on it, whatever that issue is. And I think that um, passion is a very, very important and driving force. We can't, take our emotions out of everything. That's not how we function most effectively. We function most effectively when we're able to balance, like you started out by saying, balancing our emotions with our rational mind and being able to kind of walk that middle path of both. And again, that's challenging. And I think that's why self-care is so very important, and really needs to be the basis of any mindful activism work that someone is doing, that they have a um, solid self-care ritual, that they feel balanced in themselves on a day-to-day basis, before they're engaging. Because I think that this is, it's walking a fine line. And in this climate, people are intentionally, I think, being provocative and intentionally trying to push people into that fight or flight response. And so we have to do even more work to kind of keep ourselves in a mindful and balanced place.
Yeah, and you talk about engagement, and uh, a distinction I want to make is in types of engagement and what is kind of healthy engagement versus what I would consider non-healthy or non-mindful engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And what I see a lot happen is that people engage with others wanting to get their point across, or wanting to speak or wanting to act, and they don't engage to connect. So they don't want to listen, or they don't want to take new information in. And I think that's where things get very destructive on a
Yes.
self-care level. And
Yeah.
Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! Was on a panel, and she was talking about the problem with the media from her perspective. And what she said, paraphrase, is basically that a big problem is so much of journalism today is reporting and giving opinion based on what people are seeing from outside of what's happening. That journalists don't go inside protests and talk to the people. They show the bird's eye view of the
Mm-hmm.
massive crowds, and it's all this external viewpoint, and they don't go in and talk to people about what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, what they're wanting, why they're out there. And I think that's very much, it's not just the media. I mean, I feel like that's how we as a society now kind of function from this. We make judgments from outside without having any interest of going in and connecting with people and actually having the experience that doesn't necessarily change our mind, but broadens our mind to what's actually happening.
Yeah. Yeah. As you were talking about that, it actually just reminded me of an anthropology class that I took a long time ago, where they talked about that's how you learn about culture. You don't, you have to go in and be a part of it, and that's how you and immerse yourself in it, and watch and listen, and really with the intention to connect. And um, that's how you learn, and that's how you can actually learn about these cultures. And so when you said that, it just made me think about that, because I think you're right. I think that I don't know, why journalism has skewed to this way. I don't know if it just has to do with screen culture and just kind of how different things are now, just in general. But I think you're right. I think that it's much more um, separate, and it's difficult to find voices for people who are actually inside and actually experiencing these things. Um, and that's a big challenge for sure.
Yeah, I think it's just we we it seems like we live in a society now where comfort is kind of the focus. People don't want to be uncomfortable, and I think we see that in every aspect, but I think we see it very clearly in the media, and that they show those images, one, because they get more ratings, and that's what our media now cares about. But the reason they get more ratings is because they don't challenge people's belief system. You
Yeah.
know, you show the big aerial shot of 750,000 people in Los Angeles marching, and people say, okay, and they're able to form their own opinion. So whatever their opinion was, is if they supported it, oh, that's great, look at all those people. If they didn't support it, oh, look at all those terrible people, like they need to get over it. Whatever it is, it
Yeah.
doesn't challenge them. Where if they were actually going in and talking to the people, and people were at home who were watching, were forced to actually listen in an
Hmm.
engaging way to what people are actually feeling, that will challenge opinions.
Yeah.
It'll challenge experiences, and I think
Yeah.
ratings go down because then people who don't want to be challenged don't watch.
Right.
And
Right.
so
Yeah.
it's this big kind of circular problem that
Hmm.
is part of everything in our society at the moment.
Definitely. Definitely. But I do think that one area of mindful activism that I don't think that we give enough credit to is engaging in your own personal life
Hmm.
with the people that you know and that you talk to. Um, you're right. People don't want to feel uncomfortable. And so they'll just turn the channel on something that makes them feel uncomfortable. But it's a lot harder to change the channel on your family member who's, maybe just expressing their views on one issue that's important to them. And so I think that part of being mindful is also being willing to make ourselves uncomfortable and have those uncomfortable conversations and find a way to engage in a way that's not completely comfortable. I don't think that this should be comfortable. People are not comfortable with their rights being taken away. And so I think that's part of the problem. I think that you're right that we're kind of, conditioned to like really just want things to feel good all the time and safe. And unfortunately, um, change doesn't happen that way. And so I think that even just being willing to have uncomfortable conversations with your loved ones is a way that people can really affect a significant amount of change and that's personal to them. And so everybody doesn't have to feel, there's kind of this struggle. I think people feel like there's been a lot of different protests and opportunities to physically go out and march, and people have gone and participated, and people maybe haven't gone but felt this like almost like a sense of like activism FOMO. And I kind of have to remind people, you know your life, you have to find a way to engage that's effective and that works for you. And so um, we can't get frustrated with ourselves if we don't do everything that everybody else is doing. Like we've really got to find that kind of personal connection to what this means and why I'm engaging and why this is something that I can't look away from.
Right. And I think, too, this is an oversimplification of mindfulness, but the philosophy of mindfulness is very much a micro to macro philosophy, with the micro being the idea of self. And it really starts with you as a person. It's you being mindful with yourself. You're never going to be able to be mindful with your surroundings and people around you if you can't be mindful with yourself. And that starts with self reflection and leading with understanding with yourself, and just really being honest with yourself and digging deep without judgment or opinions,
Yes.
just seeing what's really there, because until you
Mhm.
know yourself, you're not going to be able to know other people. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, yeah, I really like that. I think you're right on with that, and challenging yourself and your own beliefs. I think that we all have to do the work to kind of challenge our own beliefs and yeah, and do that work, because I think there's a lot of just, again, I think it's on the comfort level of people engaging in ways that they've known, and that it's hard because things are especially with the internet. It's like, liberals are going to be targeted by liberal and progressive sites, and that's what you're going to see. And so it's difficult to get away from that. But I also think stepping out of your box and reading books by authors that are from a different background than you. One thing that frustrates me is that for some reason, any book that a Black author writes gets put into African American literature section, whether the book is about like mass
Right.
incarceration or a comedy book, you know. But it's like venture into that section and read something that you may not feel like is for you, because I think there's a lot of work that we can do to even just kind of broaden our perspective with like what we watch and what we read and what we take in,
Yeah.
that helps us to come from a more mindful place when we are engaging.
Especially, I think that's interesting with fiction because I think with nonfiction it gets harder to take out your kind of bias in it. But if you have an author who you know has a different political stance or life experience, the way they write and the characters they write will be such great insight into why they're they have those thoughts and feelings and
Mhm.
biases and political leanings. And I think that's where we need to move in a more mindful direction, is not just stopping like we said before at this is my judgment. It's saying, okay, I have this judgment, but two things: why do I have this judgment, and
Yeah.
two, why do the person I'm judging behave that way. So
Hmm.
then you're learning about yourself plus that other person deeper, and once you get to that point you can actually come up with solutions. One of my biggest, I guess, pet peeves is when people use the words good and evil. And the reason I have a pet peeve about it is that it appears to me to often be a way to cut themselves off. So they say this person's bad, what they did was bad, end of story, lock them up, throw away the key, that's it. And it's just, to me, I don't find it productive, because where you actually find the solutions, then you're constantly at a place, if that's what you do, you're constantly at a place where when someone's bad, you lock them up, throw away the key, and then the next person who's bad comes up and you lock them up, and you're just in that cycle forever. As
Hmm.
opposed to if you let go of that judgment and dig deeper into, okay, I don't agree with this action or the way this person's behaving, but
Hmm.
why do they feel that way? What caused them to behave that way? Then you can come up with actual solutions. You can make sure that people aren't put in those situations that make them act that way. You can learn about the psychology or whatever it is, and then you're actually reducing the problem as opposed to just kind of trying to hide it as if it doesn't happen or you're separating yourself from it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that there's just, again, it goes back to that kind of need to categorize things, and when we do that, we lose so much. We lose so much. We lose connection. We lose our opportunity to learn. As soon as I put something over there as bad, then I'm not willing to learn from it, and I can't learn from it.
Yeah, and I think I don't know exactly what it, what it is, but I feel like maybe people are afraid that, and this is I think a subconscious thing for the vast majority of people, that their opinions are who they are. That's what they think. They think that their self identity is based on their political ideology or any of those kind of things that you get judgmental on or grasp onto. That it could be the music you listen to, the movies you start to identify yourself with those things. So then having those things challenged,
Hmm.
you do get into that fight or flight kind of place, because it's almost like someone's challenging your identity.
Hmm.
And I I think it's true to a point that when you do engage in mindfulness and understanding, those layers do kind of strip away. But
Hmm.
in my own experience, you don't lose your identity in that way. Like there's been so many things
Hmm.
I've thought and then got more information and it broadened the way I thought politically or on a personal level or whatever, and I didn't lose who I was. It it changed and adapted, you know?
Yeah,
If that makes
yeah.
sense.
Yeah, I think that we're complex beings, and I think the more we allow ourselves space to be a lot of things, to have different opinions, and to allow others around us that space as well, we actually come to much more of an understanding and kind of a place of like empathy than we realize. I think that human beings, I really truly believe that we genuinely do have compassion and um, good intentions. And so I think when we kind of can strip away these layers of these things that we're so tied to that we think are our identity, um, it really can help us connect and actually see the value in our differences and opinions. Because actually the differences in opinions are really helpful, and I think can help us to come to, you know, solutions and move forward when we're willing to listen and work together and be allow each other to kind of integrate that new information, and like you said, kind of allow something to challenge us and then integrate that new learning and still keep our identity, you know. But I also think to be able to do that, you do have to already be doing that self work and be in that place where you're kind of working on your own
Right.
identity. And so, yeah, I think it really does go back to the self.
Yeah, and you brought up the term complexity, and I think this is all tied into everything we've been talking about, from safety to kind of the fight or flight. Is it seems like we have a need to oversimplify everything, and that goes to the wanting to categorize everything and all that, instead of embracing the complexity or even acknowledging the complexity. I don't even feel like I see a lot of acknowledgement. Normally the political fights I see are very partisan, and both sides have simplified the situation to a very specific counter argument, and that's kind of a back and forth, and it becomes about who's more witty, and there's nothing kind of really happening. And I think that's also part of us not wanting to feel uncomfortable and wanting to feel safe, is that when it's simple, we understand it, and that's it. We're okay with it. When it's complex and it challenges us, it it just makes us uncomfortable, and we kind of, and I see why we get into, because we're uncomfortable, we then are less rational. We go to this emotional place, and then that we're at an emotional place, and then the people we're talking to are at an emotional place, which makes us more emotional, which makes them more emotional, and you're on this kind of back and forth, and
Yeah.
it keeps heightening until this tipping point, which the tipping point's an interesting concept for me, because I feel like politically we're very much nearing one. I don't think we're quite there yet, and I don't know how I feel about it, because I feel that I wish we could not have to go to a tipping point, and that we can find a mindfulness and engage in a different way without it. But looking at history and looking at um, just similar experiences I see to the political experience, I think of it almost being like drug abuse in a way,
Mm.
and how you hear so many people talk about it it almost being impossible to turn your life around as an addict until you hit that rock bottom, whatever that rock bottom is for you.
Hmm.
And so I fear us politically needing to hit that point, but then there's also a part of me that thinks maybe that's necessary for us to actually move in a more mindful direction.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, I know what you're saying because I've been thinking about this a lot because I think that change happens through discomfort and through kind of the chaos, and I don't know how much chaos we need to
Right.
to make the changes that we need. And but it's hard because even with, you know, I work with clients with addiction, and everybody's rock bottom is different.
It's different.
You know, it's whatever that is for that person. And so I think that, you know, as a whole, what's our rock bottom? I don't know. Kind of feels like it right now, but maybe we're not there yet and we're on our way. Um, but I don't know. It's hard because I think that I don't know how we create the kind of change that needs to happen without fully getting to that point.
Right.
I don't know. And it's hard when so much is motivated by money.
Mm-hmm.
That it just that just is gonna always win, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm so torn on. It's hard because I try to be rational and looking at history for clues and patterns and things like that on a very intellectual level. But there's also the fact that we're at a very different time than we've ever been with technology and with access to communication
Yeah,
and access to just information of what's happening around the world. And there's so many pros and cons to it, but it's also no one you can make predictions based on history and what you're seeing, but no one really knows because there's never been a time like this. And I
yeah,
think part of me looks at history and says, yes, we need that tipping point. But then I look at all the statistics from millennials and even the generation before them showing how much more progressive they are as a whole. That's not, yes, the younger generation is always pretty much the most progressive, but not
mhm,
to the levels that we're seeing.
right.
So it, if we're not at that tipping point, my hope is that that kind of movement and that growth that we're seeing in younger generations kind of blossoms and becomes the majority before we have
Mhm,
to hit rock bottom.
right.
But yeah, I don't know.
But who knows? Yeah,
Yeah.
who knows? Because I also think that there's rock bottom. There's going to be different levels of rock bottom, and I think that like people are going to experience rock bottom so differently. Or there are going to be people who don't feel a thing with rock bottom and actually maybe do better. Well, it will
Mm-hmm.
do better. And then there are going to be people who are completely crushed. And so it's hard because even that's going to be so nuanced that it's easy for people to still put blinders on that are, at the top of things and maybe not directly affected that that um, to even deny that it's really that bad.
Right, and I think that's the history of every political movement. I mean, you see that. I mean, I think civil rights movement is just a great example of everyone hits their rock bottom at a different time, but it seems like a country hitting rock bottom is when the majority is then at that rock bottom. Because you
Right.
see the movements. I mean, when you see movements start, it is the people who started, who are protesting first, are the people who have hit rock bottom. Those are there, and then as more people hit, more people join until the
Right.
movement's so massive that the country or the world has to adapt to it.
Right.
So, because I mean, millions of people at this point, yes, have hit rock bottom. Where I'm unsure is if it truly is uh, a majority with enough
Right.
power
Yeah.
to kind of change everything.
Yeah. See that, and I think you're right. I think that issue is the power. That there has to be enough of a majority with power before to that's affected before change will start to happen. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's kind of how we can kind of identify rock bottom a little bit more. That was helpful. That
uh,
was helpful because it's hard to even define this. Like what
right.
is you know?
And these conversations don't happen. Like you don't hear these kind of conversations on the mainstream media. And I mean, yes, they only have 2 minutes, but you don't even see them trying to do anything. So I think if anyone who's listening, if you really care about making politics and activism more mindful, it's going to have to start with you because until you have other people are not going to have those conversations for you. You need to have them with yourselves. And I even have, I mean, I've talked about it before. I have multiple family members who voted for Trump, and we have some really great conversations, and I will never agree with them on making that choice.
Right.
But I'm able to really understand where the country's at from it, because a lot of them were
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders supporters who then voted for Trump because they just wanted something that wasn't the establishment, and that was basically the end of it. And they are also feeling a lot of tension and a lot of anger, and there's a lot of trying to rationalize um, what's going on. And I see that.
Hmm.
I mean, it's not just Trump supporters who are
Yeah.
doing that. It's everyone who's opposed to him. Like, there's a lot of people rationalizing, and in doing that, you act hypocritically a lot of the time, and it kind of goes to this place. And a lot of people, when they do hit rock bottom, some people fight, and other people do anything to keep the last bit of hope they have.
Yes.
So, and I think that's an important distinction. And it's not then saying, okay, well, you voted for Trump, that's okay. It's saying, I understand why you made this choice and why you feel this way. So now we can actually have an engaged conversation about what the issues are and what's actually happening, and hopefully actually broaden minds. I don't like to say change
Yeah.
minds because you probably never will, but you can broaden
Brought in.
minds. And once you're able to have these conversations, you realize that you agree on a lot more than you thought you did. And once you're at that point, then you can come up with solutions. Once you say, oh, we agree on these things and we disagree on this thing that's actually not that important, so we can easily compromise here, and we're fixing the main solution.
Yeah.
And but we don't see those conversations happening on any power level, which is the
Power level.
media,
Right.
or with politicians. I mean, we rarely see it anyways. We don't even see, I don't want to blame politicians or the media, because we don't even do it around kitchen tables when we're
Right,
together with
exactly. And
family.
that's what I'm
So when
saying is let's even just start having these conversations around the kitchen table, because
right,
there's a space where we can talk about it. And I think that, when you talk about your multiple family members that voted for Trump, and I think one thing that stood out to me was that you continue to be willing to engage with them. And I think that's part of the work that we have to do, is recognizing that that person has their difference of opinion, and you don't have to agree with that opinion. You don't have to ever, like you said, the goal is not to change minds, but also not to feel victimized personally because of that person's vote. I think it's important to do that. I think when we kind of personalize and feel, and I get it can be painful finding out somebody
right,
who, you were close with, voted a certain way. And I definitely understand that. But I think that when we personalize it and kind of, come at it from that perspective, then we're not willing to listen. And so I think that willingness to not take it personally on your part is a big part of that, of how we engage.
right. And it's interesting because I feel a lot of people talk about the government, and I hear it on every side with every kind of political ideology you can have about the government being the problem. And I don't feel people ever ask themselves, well, what is the government? The government is literally just something that humans created as a concept, made up of humans. So we're
Right.
talking about changing the conversation around the dinner table, and that is the most powerful way we can change the government, because the government is just made out of people. It's
Right.
people who have grown up around kitchen tables where no one agreed, and then they go get elected and then don't agree. If we
Right.
were in a society where the day-to-day interactions we were having were more mindful, our government would be more mindful.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
yes, if you're in a dictatorship, maybe not. But
Maybe
in the
not. Right.
way our country is still structured, and there's issues with it that make it harder for this to be a reality, but it's still
Yeah.
very much a reality that if we were being more mindful every day with the people around us, and enough of us were doing that, we would start to see changes of the macro level all the way
Yeah.
through what the government is doing.
Yeah. I agree. Well, so let's start having those conversations.
Right. And start the conversations here. I mean, so many people are on social media, and if you have topics you would like us to discuss, or things you want to talk about, create your own platform to do so. Because even if we only have 5 viewers that are all your family members, you're expressing yourself, which helps your self care. Plus, those are 5 people who are at a minimum getting to know you better and understand you better and share the experiences you've experienced.
Yeah, very true. I love that.
Okay, so we're gonna end with a quote. I had to, um, yeah, I think this one's better. So this is Pema Chodron. The most fundamental harm we can do to ourselves is to remain ignorant by not having the courage and the respect to look at ourselves honestly and gently.
Mm,
And I think
awesome.
that very much sums up our entire conversation.
Definitely. All right. Thank you guys.
Yes, and join us on Twitter or Facebook at CivilD TV. Have a wonderful week.
Bye, everybody.